Today we're going to talk a little bit about how the Buddha turned selfishness into compassion by looking at an early sutta and some interpretations we can make about what the Buddha meant. Coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And YouTube tells me that if you click the bell, you'll get notifications, so consider doing that as well. If you're interested in courses, also sort of a deeper dive into the Dharma, check out my courses over on the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org, including a new course that I have out just now called Work, Money, and Pleasure. You can see a link to it down below. One of my favorite suttas from the early tradition is a sutta where a king and queen are having a small conversation with each other. It seems as though King Pasenadi is fishing for a compliment from his wife, Queen Mallika. And so he asks her who the person is that she loves most dearly in the entire world. He seems, we can expect, there's no backstory here in the sutta, but the way the question is pitched, we might imagine that the king is sort of expecting his wife to say, "You, dear king, are the most wonderful person in my life. You are the most wonderful person in the world. You are the most beloved to me." But the queen, being a very level-headed woman, says that I myself, she says, I myself am most dear to me. And the king, and then she turns the question back on the king. She says, and who is most dear to you, dear king? And he says, we might expect with some abashedness or a little bit downhearted, says, yes, in fact, I am most dear to myself as well. And these expressions of self-love are then turned by the Buddha into expressions of compassion for others. And we'll turn to that in a moment. But my good friend Jorge Seguel Sapiens had a discussion about this sutta with some of his students. And it seems like they brought up a very, I think, important questions about this, which is to ask how it is that these expressions of self-love then lead to compassion. Because you might think that all that they're doing, the king and queen, is saying, I love myself, which seems a very good expression of selfishness. And so the question is, how does this self-love not simply turn into, or not simply be an example of, selfishness, where we simply are self-centered, all we care about is ourselves, we don't care about anybody else because we love ourselves most dearly, which is what they both say. But the Buddha does not take them that way. Indeed, the Buddha frames it entirely differently. He has a verse that he says at the end. The Buddha says, "On traversing all directions with the mind, one finds no one anywhere dearer than oneself. Likewise, everyone holds themselves most dear. Hence, one who loves himself or herself should not harm another." So everyone holds themselves most dear, so no one should harm another. And this is the way that the Buddha turns an expression of self-love, an expression of, we might say, egotism, into an expression of compassion, of thinking well of others, of not wanting to harm others. And we might ask, how is that sort of turn supposed to be made in our minds? Now, the Buddha doesn't really describe that in any detail in this sutta. There's no real further expression of how we're supposed to make this kind of turn. But I think we can speculate in various ways about how we could go ahead and make that turn ourselves. One of these ways, I would suggest, follows a technique of a recent philosopher named John Rawls, who in the 20th century was probably most famous for coming up with a theory of justice, of how philosophically to ground an ideal of justice in the world. And one of the ways that he did this is through a kind of thought experiment, where he asked for us to consider what a just world would look like. And he says a just world would be the kind of world where we could stand outside of it, be behind what he calls a veil of ignorance, without knowing who we were in that world, without knowing, if you like, if we consider ourselves in this thought experiment as not having been born yet, as we don't know who we're going to be born as. We don't know where we're going to be born. We don't know when we're going to be born. We don't know under what circumstances we're going to be born. And so what we want to do is to construct a society in which our birth, no matter where we are, is going to be as good as it can possibly be under the circumstances of the society. So this is the kind of thought experiment that John Rawls comes to. That is, he's thinking along, we might say, similar lines to the Buddha here. The Buddha here is saying, we all love ourselves most dear, so we shouldn't want to harm another. We're all basically the same in loving ourselves most dearly. And in the same way, Rawls is suggesting that we don't know who we really are, let's say. Well, let's put ourselves into a situation where we don't know who we really are. We want to construct a society in which nobody is being harmed, in which we could potentially be born as any person in that society and be happy. However, this approach to the question of grounding, in this case justice, but in a bigger sense ethics entirely, all of ethics, grounding it in some way, it may be too difficult for some people. They may not really be able to get outside their own minds and think in the shoes of another person. So there's another way around this, which is to ask, if we love ourselves most dearly, what does that imply for how we should behave in the world? What are the kind of actions that we should undertake that will make our lives best? In other words, is it best for us to spend our time, say, acquiring a bunch of stuff and piling it up in our house and in our garage, piling up a bunch of wealth in our bank accounts? Is it good for us to harm others in the pursuit of gain and wealth and fame? And here we might ask, is our possessions a real secure refuge? And of course, they're certainly something of a refuge. Having certain things is not bad for us in certain respects. It can certainly allow us to do certain things. Having a shovel will allow us to dig a hole if we need to dig a hole. So it's not necessarily that all possessions are bad, or their possessions are necessarily bad in every circumstance, but they also require maintenance on our part. They require us to protect them, to keep them ready, to keep them in a state of where they're working, if we're talking about machines, to keep them from rust, if we're talking about, let's say, a shovel. So they also require their own maintenance. And we know that in a broader scheme, they're not a secure refuge in the sense that any possessions that we own can be taken from us, can be lost, can be stolen. And in the final analysis, we obviously can't take them with us when we die. So they're not a completely secure refuge, and we certainly can't take us with them into illness and old age. Again, possessions can be helpful in those circumstances, but only a certain number of possessions. This sort of a tendency in modern society to pile up as many things as we can, that is, of course, not going to be useful to us. A certain number, a modest number of possessions can be helpful. And in the broader scheme, we might ask about harming other people, because I think, especially in the news nowadays, we hear a lot about people who undertake very greedy kinds of acquisitions by harming other people, by attempting to harm them, by taking from them by force or by other kinds of underhanded means. And we might ask, is harming other people really to our benefit if we're going to love ourselves most dearly? And we might ask also about the effects of something like karma. Now, karma in the traditional sense is something that is pretty much guaranteed. You're guaranteed in the traditional sense to have recompense for what you do that's ill, that harms other people, that's done out of a bad intention, even into our next lifetimes. From a more this life kind of interpretation of karma, karma is not necessarily guaranteed. It's not as though all evil is always punished and all good is always rewarded. That would be too much to say. But it certainly is, we might say, something like a probability kind of thing. In other words, if you're going to harm other people in your quest to gain influence and power, it's going to make it more likely that you're going to have suffering later on in your life. Because the people that you harm are only going to want ill for you. And they're only going to be the sort of people who will stab you in the back when they can get the chance, because they don't like what you've done, because they feel hatred towards you. On the other hand, helping other people to live better lives as well, can be of great benefit to you, because people who you help will feel kindness towards you and want to help you. And in particular, if you're in a stage, as all of us are from time to time, where you need help, then having other people who you have been kind to is only going to make your rise out of whatever troubles you're in easier. So we might again ask this question, that if you are most dear to yourself, should you treat other people kindly, or should you harm other people? And I think the question answers itself. If you love yourself most dearly, you should be kind to others, because they can be kind. They will then be more prone to be kind to you in return. There is a very famous and I think important simile about the dangers of anger and hatred and harming others, which comes, it actually comes from Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga, which is a 5th century text in the Common Era. Buddhaghosa being a redactor and commentator of the early Buddhist texts, a scholar of him, and a philosopher himself. It's believed sometimes to have come from the Buddha, but the great recent Buddhist teacher and scholar Bodhipaksa has a wonderful fake Buddha quotes about this, and he says, I've got a link to it down in the show notes if you're interested, so you can go and read his blog article, but basically he says, no, this doesn't come from the Buddha, it comes from Buddhaghosa. Any event, Buddhaghosa writes that if you get angry with someone, he says, you're like a person who wants to hit another and picks up a burning ember or excrement in your hand, and so first burns yourself or makes yourself stink. And I think this is a wonderful simile because it I think perfectly illustrates the problem with hatred, anger, with harming others. Because it's not as though hatred or anger or harming others doesn't actually do the deed. It can. I mean, we can indeed, by fomenting anger in ourselves, we can do indeed harm to others, perhaps who may themselves deserve it. Who knows? I'm not going to say necessarily in every case that we're wrong. But what we do, however, is we harm ourselves in the process. Now, first of all, we harm ourselves by, as Buddhaghosa says, the stench that we leave on ourselves by doing it. In other words, once we fall into the same level as, let's say, the hate-filled people that we ourselves are angry towards, we're only getting into their muck. As people have said about, what is it, that don't wrestle with a pig because you'll lose and the pig will enjoy it. That's kind of the point here, is we're only harming ourselves in the view of other people by engaging in the same problematic conduct that we ourselves don't like. In other words, the problem itself is anger and hatred directed towards others as much as anything. And so we ourselves shouldn't put that stench on ourselves in the broader picture of society. That's its own harm. But in a deeper sense, we're harming ourselves just in the way that by holding a burning ember, we burn ourselves too, because we're basically corrupting our own minds. In other words, if to the extent that we emphasize anger in ourselves and act in ways that make anger arise more readily, we're only harming our own minds. Now we may say, oh, in this circumstance this person deserved it, and again, perhaps they did, perhaps the person you're angry with did something very bad and needs to be chastised, but what we're doing is making it more likely to come up in other circumstances. The more that we promote states of anger, states of greed, states of ignorance or delusion in ourselves, the more that they're liable to remain. And that is itself a danger for us. So when we think of anger, we should think of it as this burning ember, or this hot poker, or this excrement that itself may be able to do a deed, but it does it in a way that harms us just as much, although in different ways, than it harms the other person. So these are ways in which anger, hatred, harming others, all of which I'm sort of bundling together, but they're on similar kinds of states, similar kinds of mental states. All of these things are things that we should avoid if we love ourselves, if we hold ourselves most dear. And so now I think we can see how the Buddha might have said that since all of us love each other, or I should say, since all of us love ourselves, we should love each other as well. Since all of us love ourselves, we should not harm each other. And we can see this now from both sides. If we think of it from the side of the other person, of course, nobody wants to be harmed. Or if we simply are unable to get outside of ourselves, then even from our own perspective, we should have a kind of ethical kind of egoism where we're starting with ourselves, but understanding that we're only hurting ourselves if we're doing these things. Now, I think if we understand the Mallika, this sutta with Queen Mallika and King Pasenadi well, we can begin to see why it is that, for example, when teaching loving kindness, the Buddha, and indeed in early Buddhism, you don't find the practice of directing loving kindness towards yourself. Many people have found this rather surprising nowadays because we tend to practice loving kindness towards ourselves. And I have videos on this I'll put a link to, but one of the reasons I think, perhaps, at least arguably, that the Buddha didn't have us practice a loving kindness towards ourselves is because he felt that it was simply common knowledge that everyone already loved themselves, that everyone already had kindness towards themselves. It's rather like you can imagine somebody who is asking a trainer to go to the gym, and the trainer can see that you already have enormous biceps, right? So he's not going to tell you, or she's not going to tell you, do bicep exercises when you're at the gym. They're going to tell you, no, you need a more rounded kind of physique here, you need to work on other muscles. So they're going to tell you to do other things on your triceps and different parts of your body. In the same way, I think we can understand the Buddha may have said, look, we understand you already have a kindness towards yourself, you already hold yourself most dear, so let's work on everything else. And having said that, I think we can see quite easily how it is that the kind of attitude that both the Queen and the King displayed here can be problematic, because an overweening love for yourself, an overweening holding yourself dear, can lead to clinging, can lead to clinging to yourself, can lead to a reification of yourself as some kind of a permanent entity. And this is the kind of thing that the Buddha, of course, felt was a problem, because it led, not necessarily because it led to us behaving unethically or something, not necessarily anyhow, but rather because it led to dukkha, because it led to suffering in the longer term, because we ourselves change. We ourselves are always in ups and downs. We change how we have outlooks on life, we change how good we are at certain things. As we get older, we lose certain of our capacities. And to the extent that we cling to ourselves most dear, these kinds of natural processes of life, and in particular old age and sickness and death, can become real stumbling blocks for us. They can lead to real deep feelings of insecurity and even sadness and anger, because ourselves, that thing that we hold most dear, ourselves are beginning to decay in one way or another, or they're not functioning the way we would prefer them to do. So part of practice is, while holding ourselves dear in some respect, is to do that without this kind of clinging, with this awareness of the change of all things. Now, nowadays, I think some of you will realize that nowadays we have a different problem. That is to say, nowadays many teachers teach loving kindness towards ourselves because many of us have self-hatred. Many of us have a kind of an aversion to ourselves. We don't like ourselves for one reason or another. And this seems to be more of a modern kind of problem. It doesn't seem to have been so much of a problem during the Buddha's day, but it is a problem nowadays. And this leads to a different problem that the Buddha points out, which is the problem of nihilism. So on the one hand, we have eternalism, where a clinging to ourself leads to a feeling that we ourselves are permanent in some way, that we're never going to go away, that we have a permanent soul that's always going to be there. The Buddha says that's not a correct way of looking at things. But the Buddha also talks about nihilism, where he says that some people really just want to stop existing. And that can come from, and so the Buddha was aware of the problem, at least the potential problem, and perhaps there were some people around at his day who displayed this problem that he was aware of. But he says, in the same way, we should also be concerned about nihilism of ourselves, that we don't exist, or we don't want to exist, or that we want to go away, that we're so aversive to ourselves that we sort of wish that we would sort of cease existing in some sense. And nihilism of this kind can lead to any number of different problems, the most dire of which is suicidal tendencies, but I would hope that would not be your case. If it is, then please do seek out help. There are many good hotlines that you can call, good medical help that you can get. But if that's not the issue, we can have an issue of sort of not caring for ourselves. Because in a sense we sort of don't want to exist, we don't see ourselves as worthy, and so we're not willing to put in the effort. So there's a kind of a balance that we have to have in so much of Buddhism, this kind of middle way. And the balance here, we can understand, is a balance between, on the one hand, not clinging to ourselves, not loving ourselves so dearly that we're unwilling to put up with our own change, our own inevitable change over time, but also not being aversive to ourselves so much that we're not willing and able to put in the effort to make ourselves better in some respect. In order to make ourselves better, we have to be aware of change on the one hand, that is, we can change. We have to be aware of our own deficiencies in some sense, that is, that we're not perfect in everything, that although we may hold ourselves dear, we don't think that we're perfect, which again is a problem for some of us. So it's this kind of middle ground, it's this awareness of our own difficulties without allowing that to curdle into a total disenchantment or total aversion towards ourselves, because neither of those extremes are going to be beneficial or skillful for us. So if you find this kind of approach to yourself and to finding yourself dear useful, check out my Patreon page. Check out how you can perhaps help support the channel. Check out the courses. Give this a thumbs up if you like it. That can always also be helpful. Send it around to anybody you think might benefit from this kind of teaching. And I hope we'll catch all of you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.